All right, welcome back to today's episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Tolber from Redlands PD in California. She's going on 28 years in law enforcement. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's been a long time coming. So, welcome to the show, Chief Tolber. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Paige. I'm excited we're finally connecting.
Me too. So, we've connected a few times, just kind of, through the circles. And, I know you participate in a lot of wellness conferences, and wellness is something that's really important to you. So I'm really excited to hear your perspective on the topic of wellness and leadership. But I was hoping that we can first start with some background on you. 28 years is a long time. So
Yeah.
did you know that you always wanted to start in law enforcement or be in law enforcement, or how did that happen?
It's kind of a funny story. I thought that I would go into federal law enforcement. My folks are really involved with forensics, and that was where I thought I was going to go. And then I ended up coming out to Redlands to go to the university. And kind of funny story, I ended up getting a parking ticket, and I came in to fight my parking ticket, which I didn't get it excused, and I paid, and obviously the best parking ticket I've ever had in my life. But I started talking with, he was the captain then, and then later our chief. And he said, oh, tell me a little bit about yourself. And I said, I'm really interested in behavioral sciences and policing. And at the time, I was doing a program where I needed to do an internship. And so I was telling him all about it. And he's like, oh, well, don't think I can fix your parking ticket, but, we could do an internship. And I was like, really? And he said, yeah. So I came back in 97 and started here as an intern. And as I was working at the local level with all the officers here, I already loved Redlands, but I fell in love with local policing and the department, and the rest is history. I've been here ever since.
Wow, I didn't know that. That is
Yeah.
a really funny story. I love that he saw potential in you and was willing to have a conversation with you. And I always think about this. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but I always kind of look back on events in my life, and I find it really interesting that we kind of land where we were meant to be without sometimes even knowing where we were going. And so I love that story that you're like, I got a parking ticket, tried to fight it. Someone took the time to talk to me, saw potential in me. And now 28 years later, I'm the chief of police. Like, that is such an incredible story.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because my husband and I always have this debate, like, is it serendipity or synchronicity? I always say it's serendipity. He says synchronicity, but whatever you call it,
Yeah.
absolutely, life has a way of unfolding. And I think if you have a general idea of where you want to go and you're open to discussing it with folks when those opportunities arise, you just never know where you'll end up.
Yeah, I love that. Do
So
you
yeah.
think that now, because you had that experience and now you're in a leadership position, do you kind of take that time too to talk to other people and try to understand what their goals are and where they want to go and try to help them get there because you had someone who did that with you?
Absolutely. And also taking the time. I, I've had the opportunity to go and talk with, youth in the community and reiterating that message, be prepared, like do what you're passionate about, and be prepared to talk about that because you never know who you're going to be talking with and where that'll lead. So reiterating that message to them, but then also having the opportunity when I'm talking with them to hear what they're thinking and where they want to go and helping to make the connections. Because obviously, if it's policing, that's great, and we can help make those connections. But there's also a lot of other connections and a lot of other interests, and being able to help other folks find their way. I
Yeah,
think is really important.
I like the word that you use of being open. And I think that, when we have goals, sometimes it's scary to share those things with other people and to say, hey, this is what I want to do, or this is what I want out of life, especially when you're younger. Like, I think back to when I was young and I was really nervous and shy to share any of those things because maybe I didn't want to be judged, or, I didn't um, maybe want people to like think it was silly. I don't know. And so for you to have this conversation of like, hey, like be courageous, be
Mm-hmm.
open to sharing what your goals are because you never know who might be able to lead you in that direction. And I really like that message a lot.
well, good. Like I say, it served me well for 28 years. So
Yeah, well, you had the courage to step out there and be like, yes, this is what I want to do. And then someone's like, all right, let's do it.
that's
So,
exactly right. That's exactly right.
I was telling you offline, I really love when I get to speak to another woman. I have interviewed 250 chiefs across the country so far, and I think maybe 6 to 8 have been female. We know that it's a male dominated profession. What
Mm.
was your experience like entering into this career as a female? Do you feel like there were different challenges, but also maybe different advantages to entering in, a male dominated career?
Yeah, absolutely. I am, I was like trying to do the math in my head when you said the numbers, and really they do say in executive positions, I think it's like 3 to 5% women in executive positions. And nationally, we're looking at about 12% women in policing. And there's effort certainly to raise those numbers and research and questions. And, my background, those are all things that are of interest to me. Generally speaking, research and policing, but specifically when you talk about women. And so nationally, there's been about 12% representation of women. And I think, starting out, there were very few women. And so the idea of representation matter, right? See other women in these different positions, and thinking about what you're going to do. And so I talk about that a little bit in becoming a chief, right? Because if there's not that many of us even thinking about becoming a chief, that wasn't something until much later in my career. But I feel very fortunate here in our department. It's always been very supportive of me, and I think there's always the challenges just because there aren't as many of us. But it's also there's a lot of opportunities too, right? There's opportunities to learn and grow, and then again, going back to having those conversations outside the organization, I think is really helpful. I think when I think back over my career, how people react to me as a woman in policing, frequently in positive and surprising ways,
Mm.
especially um, dealing with victims, but even with suspects as well, right? So, I think there's challenges. I think when we talked before, I mentioned that really it wasn't probably until midway through my career that I really experienced more of those challenges, and that's when I became a mom.
Mm.
And that was, I think, probably the biggest challenge for me was balancing my family and my children with my career. And at that point, I had about 15 years in, and I was a sergeant, I was a supervisor, and again, kind of that whole being a woman in a male dominated profession, was the first female sergeant, first female lieutenant, right? First. And so I was the first female sergeant, and just learning how to balance that. And then I think also organizationally learning, how to balance um, what that's like, with new parents. But I don't think, and I have this conversation a lot with my folks, is it's not necessarily a woman issue, right? Because it's an everybody issue. And what I realized was, even though I was dealing with those challenges and balancing the family, all the guys that were working for me at the time in the bureau were also balancing
Mm.
those issues, right?
Right.
And we want to talk about it as a woman issue, but it's not. It's a people issue, right? Anyone who has a family who's trying to balance having kids and two parents working and everything else, and
Yeah.
really opening up our eyes that way. So to me, I think those were probably some of the bigger challenges, but also really great opportunity to open up my network and learn from a lot of the other women that I was working with about how they balance that, and then being able to share what I learned and how I sorted that out with those who I work with now. And what I didn't say early on is that I'm married to a first responder also, who's recently retired but spent 30 years in the fire service. So, he'd be gone on fire assignment and I was on call. And so balancing, what that looks like, those I think were the bigger challenges for me.
I want to know what the jokes are in your household between fire and PD, we know that, the jokes are always really funny. So I would love to like be a
Mm.
fly on the wall while you guys kind of joke back and forth with each other about that. But
Oh, yes.
there are a
Lots of
few
ribbing, lots of ribbing.
for sure. There were a few things that you said I wanted to kind of circle back to, but I had someone recently, they were talking about, and it wasn't in the context of, male versus female, it was just in the context of
Mhm.
leadership and, you know, how competitive it is to, get where you want to go, right? There's only a couple slots. Everyone's kind of, competing against each other, if you will, for these, specific roles. And they say, you're put in a position to be really competitive, but then once you get there, you have to be really selfless and you have to like care about everyone else. And they're talking about this like interesting dynamic. Do you think that, because maybe the pool was smaller with other executives or leadership who were women, did you find it easy to reach out to people and to be able to talk to them? Or did you feel like because it was so competitive and the pool was so small that maybe it was harder? Because I've had other conversations, along
Mhm.
these lines of like, um, what that does when everyone's, so competitive against each other.
So it's interesting for sure. It sounds like you're asking me more like in the chief role or in the executive role as opposed to early on. I will
Yeah.
say early on, being an only or one of a few, right? There was an interest in from my supervisors to get me to test and promote. And there were
Mm,
a couple of times where I just said, I don't feel like I'm ready for that. And, I'm going to sit that out. Right. And there's all those kind of other struggles. It's funny that you say that because there's a couple other executives in the area who we came up together in this organization and we would test together for like corporal, right? That's your first promotion. And I was chuckling with this one chief because he goes, yeah, I remember we were all like studying together, in your apartment and we were all studying for this test. So to simply answer your question, I think that there is a lot of pressure, right, for a few positions, especially in a smaller agency. I know we didn't really start out with a little bit more intro into, my agency and everything else. We're 98 sworn, so it's smaller. There's not a whole bunch of turnovers, so the
mm,
timing, right, that matters for promotions. But I've always been of the mind that um, it's important to share the information that I have, and that actually by teaching and studying with other people, it only makes all of us better. It
yeah.
makes me better for the test. It makes them better. It creates a better environment, right? As opposed to that really cutthroat environment. So for me coming up, that was really important. And I was really fortunate because I had some mentors that were willing to set up mock panels,
Mm,
mock oral panels for us, and help us all. Because really it's like you're all getting better, right? No matter who ends up getting the promotion. Um, when it came, so that's kind of coming up to answer that first part of the question. The second part in the executive position, I think for me, and I don't know if it's because of smaller organization, be interesting to speak with other leaders in different size organizations. But for me, really reaching outside to some of my mentors and my friends externally was really, really important and helpful
mm,
to me. Um, and I think that can be for a couple of reasons, not so much because of that, competitive culture, but more so because as you rise through the ranks and as get to these different roles in your leadership uh, journey, you're seeing a much wider view, right? And so I think that the more feedback that you can get externally, the wider view you have when you're coming in to sit at the table. And so for me, that network and that connection that bridges from the East Coast to the West Coast through some of the programs that I've been involved in over the years was really, really helpful in terms of preparing me. And we still, work internally together. It's just you're talking about a much smaller group of people. And so I think that when you look externally, you can bring those different resources and those thought processes and that benefit internally into your organization.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
It made total sense. And I appreciated you saying like helping to build each other up. It's not a zero sum game.
Yeah.
Everyone wins when that happens. Yes, of course, maybe there's one person that gets that promotion and the other person or everyone else who's, trying for it doesn't get it, but it's not a zero sum game. It's not like there's winners and losers. One person got the promotion, but everyone was able to elevate each other. And that helps to bring the organization forward in a more positive way. So I really appreciate you saying it's not a zero sum game. Like, how can we operate as a team and how can we help to build
Mm-hmm.
each other up instead of trying to tear each other down? I also appreciate the sentiment of trying to get different outside perspectives. I do think that, and I'm so guilty of this, that we have like our one track of how we tend to think. We also have like what's going on in our day to day life, and so we kind of get this tunnel vision of like the grind of like this is my reality. And so to have other people in your network that are able to give you different perspectives and ways of seeing things and a different type of support as well,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes you need that. You need someone to offer you advice. And sometimes for me, I need people to like shake my shoulders a little bit too. Like if they're like, hey, like you're only thinking of it in like this really narrow way, like you need to like maybe think of it in a different way. So I thought both of those
Mm-hmm.
were really, really solid pieces.
Thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love the way that you put that as zero sum. A mentor and friend of mine talks about, lifting or rising waters lift all. What is it? I
Mm.
don't know the saying. The rising tides
Rise,
lift all boats.
all ships. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Rising all ships.
Yeah.
Right. So that same idea really, I think applies. And there's a lot fewer words than my whole story that I told you. So
Yeah. Well, I
yeah.
agree. And, and I don't know, maybe this is like a totally, off topic thing, but a lot of what I'm seeing in the wellness space, and of course, I'm a fly on the wall, like I'm an outsider, and this is just my perspective of what I've seen, but I connect with a lot of leadership teams who are really on board with wellness. This conversation is something that's happening all across the country from an executive level. I have met very few, and I'm sure that there's some out there, but I've met very few um, chiefs or leaders of organizations who are against wellness. Everyone is having this conversation of how do we help to support the organization and the wellness of the organization and create culture and resources, and a lot of the stigma that I'm seeing is from a peer-to-peer perspective. So the judgment of, peers for each other. And I'm seeing it, I'm like, that's really interesting. And I could see how, maybe you would be afraid to reach for certain things if a peer is maybe judging you. And so the conversation has come to light of like, how do we push forth the message that it's a human. We're talking about humans. It's a people game, if you will, like quotes. But how do you put forth the message of that it is a team and that recognizing that everyone on the team is going to need different resources, they're going to learn in different ways, and like how do we support that? How does everyone show up for each other in a way that's positive rather than judgmental? Because again, it's like you said, the rising tides, like you're only as strong as your weakest link. And how can we raise everybody up to a level that's really positive? I don't know if you're seeing that. That's something that, conversation that's come up a few times, but it's like how can we make it, it doesn't have to be a family, but how can we make it a team, where everyone is
Mm-hmm.
lifting each other up?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think, probably all chiefs, all departments are having these different conversations. And depending on where you're at, it probably looks different. It was funny as I was thinking about, talking with you today. And I remember when I first started, so this was probably like 98, 99. And I had a sergeant, one of my first sergeants that I worked for. And I remember him telling me, hey, this job is a lot. It's a great career. And you're going to do a lot of great things, but there's also going to be a lot of heavy things that you see and experience. And it's really important that you take your time off. You're going to work overtime, you're going to do all these things, but it's important to take your time off. It's important to stay physically fit and to take care of yourself that way. And I really listened to what he had to say, and adhered to that. And then probably maybe 3 or 4 years later, I was working in a different assignment, and I was working with a colleague of mine who I still keep in touch with. He's retired now, but he was, I guess, once a Marine, always a Marine, retired from Marines, worked here. And I remember him telling me, Rachel, you're going to see things. And at some point, you'll kind of hit that barrier. And he told me a story about his own experience, and how it really altered kind of his perspective, how he was addressing and dealing with folks, family, work, and talked about really breaking down that stigma that it is okay to seek counseling, to do these things, to seek help when you need it. So my point in sharing that story with you is that, I think we've been talking about it for a long time, but we've been talking about it in different ways,
Mm.
probably, or at least organizationally. And so the shift really, I think, is, how do you build that into the culture, um, and provide resources and opportunities to address wellness, in whatever way, folks need it. And I really appreciate what you said, and I think it's really important that wellness really is, we use this term, but it's so big, it's so broad, and it covers so many different things. It's not just physical well-being, which it certainly is, but financial, right? How do we teach people coming in? And I feel really fortunate that somebody sat down and was like, look, this may be the first time that you're, making really good money, but how important it is to do deferred comp, to save, to invest, to do these things. So there's the financial aspect of that. There's the emotional side, right? Whether that's investing in your spiritual beliefs, utilizing counseling, those kinds of things. So I just think there's this whole vast array. And I didn't even go into it, right? There's sleep, there's a whole science on sleep and what we're doing with that, knowing what we know. Like I think about what I did, in my first 5 years versus what I would do now and know now, and we're working on a new building and looking at, okay, are there sleep places so that, our folks that, are having to drive home, right, after working a
Yeah.
12 and a half hour shift, or have to go to court, have, that ability. So there's so many different aspects. And I think, that's where you're probably having these really great and interesting conversations with people throughout the country, because everybody's focusing on different areas. Some folks are looking at all areas or a lot of areas. Some may be more finite, but there's a lot of really interesting things going on. And I think assessing what's important to your organization and to your team, and then building that support system out is really important.
Yeah. And, you had used when we talked, and we've talked a few times, we use this word holistic, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that that really encompasses what you're talking about and I think that sometimes we almost limit ourselves. And I love that you brought up some like unique things that maybe others who are listening to this podcast have never considered of like, how can there be spaces for people to sleep so that it's not unsafe for them to drive home, so they have the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to stay there and then go to court in the morning. These out of the box conversations, I think, are so important to try to challenge ourselves as to what is the definition or what does organizational wellness and culture really look like. And I think before we had, maybe a couple different pillars. And now as we start to have these conversations, those pillars are starting to grow, and maybe you can start to
Mm-hmm.
like put, a lot of things in different buckets. But I've had a lot of people, and you mentioned kind of mentorship, and I've had a lot of conversations. Okay, well, what does is professional development a part of wellness? Is community engagement a part of wellness? There's a lot of different, I think, pillars that maybe haven't been explored as deeply as maybe some of the core ones. And so I really appreciate that you kind of zoomed it out a little bit, because obviously California is really progressive in leading the charge and always has with wellness. I also think that in this, you said this without saying it, of this idea of how can you lead by example, regardless of what your role is within the organization. I don't think that you have to be a leader to lead. I think that you can lead by example by taking care of yourself, prioritizing those things for you, because it has to start with you. But then, how can you also help to mentor and guide others to also be able to take care of themselves in different ways? I love that throughout this whole conversation, you've mentioned different people in your life and career who had your back, who looked at you and said, hey,
Mhm.
you're entering into this new position that's really tough. Here are some things to do. And then you said, I took that to heart because I respected this person and I knew that they had my back. How can we show up for other people? That's not like, you know, intrusive. I think people know when someone like genuinely, has the right intentions, but how can we lead by example and then show up for other people and teach them the things that maybe we had to learn the hard way? Maybe that
Mhm.
person who told you that said that because maybe they had experience, I don't know, with, not sleeping or not doing certain things. And I think we can pass on those life lessons that we have with other people so that they can improve and learn from us.
No, I think it is really important. And it's interesting because that concept of being a leader, not necessarily in rank or title, but within the organization. And I think about so many folks here in our organization that definitely live that motto. They're um, supporting other folks, whether it's through field training or as a supervisor. Talking about eating, looking at different ideas. I think one of the things that drew me to Redlands in the first place was the openness to try different things. If you brought new things up, that the administration would support you in trying to pursue those. And so it's nice because I think that that's still a part of the culture. Um, at least I still see it in folks that are like, hey, we have this idea, can we try it? Whether it's healthy food, vending machine or whatever. And now not all of those things always work out. Maybe there's not as much of a need or desire, but there's folks thinking about, okay, these are things that are working for me. And, is there a way to bring them to the organization? And then you kind of see what folks latch on to and what works for them. But at least having that openness and ability for folks to lead at all levels.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's a
it's
really
good.
interesting conversation to have because, I think we can think about this, as an organization, but I think we can also think about this in our own personal lives and our own personal wellness. Sometimes when we try things and they don't work, then there's a resistance to continue trying things. And I had someone put this as like that related to dating. They're like, okay, what if you went on one bad date? And then after that,
Never one
you were
again.
like, never again. I had a bad
Yeah,
experience once and that's it.
yeah.
You're limiting yourself, to be able to find that thing that does work for you and that does benefit your life. And I really liked that analogy or that comparison because it was like, okay, that makes total sense. Like, no one's going to go on. I mean, how many bad dates we have to go on before you found, and so
Sure.
I think the same can apply to wellness, whether that's personal or organizational. There are some things that are going to work for some people that aren't going to work for others. And so, how can we continue to have, like you said, that open mind to trying stuff until we find the things that work, for us personally, or until the organization can find those
Hmm.
things that works as a whole.
Yeah. No, that's a great analogy for sure. I may have to borrow that.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and we talked a little bit about the why and how your why kind of changes throughout your career. In terms of wellness, why is wellness something that's so important to you? And have you had any personal experiences, maybe personally or professionally with wellness that has helped to kind of anchor in that why?
Sure. I've had a variety of different things happen over the years that um, have made this important on a personal level. Having gone through challenges in a first marriage, some medical challenges. I had melanoma twice. Um, those are the times in your life where you really stop and question, okay, what am I doing? And, how do I take care of myself so that I can take care of others, right?
Mm.
Something that I think about a lot now as a mom and also, as a chief. Um, and so I think those challenges are really good because they make you stop and pause and reflect on truly what's important, and being able to share that knowledge and that information about what you go through with other people. And it is important to do that. I think, it's not something that I necessarily have, uh, you know, in a big public conversation, but when I've worked with folks that are maybe struggling or, dealing with a medical issue and concern, being able to um, both be empathetic to what they're going through, and compassionate. I like that. Compassion is empathy in action, right? That idea of
Mm.
those things going together, but being able to help provide resources for them, to be able to come out of those situations. I think that's really important. I think too. So that's on a personal level. Now on a professional level, it's funny, right? I've told you about some of these things that have happened in the past with different supervisors. And I had a supervisor years ago who was like peer support. And I didn't really understand that. At the time, I thought, man, if I'm going to go talk to someone, it's not going to be, or, about what's going on in
Mm.
my marriage or whatever. It's not going to be one of my coworkers. But what I didn't truly understand, probably until I was a sergeant working and professional standards. I was working with a lot of folks who had retired and they were coming back for their concealed weapons permits. And I would listen to some of the stories about what they experienced when they were out on an extended injury, right?
Mm.
Or how they felt negatively about the department. And I was like, oh, like a light bulb went off for me about how important peer support is, not as a counseling, service per se, but as that connection with the department for somebody who's just going through a rough time,
Yeah.
somebody reaching out and identifying that, hey, they're not, going back to what I told you early about, my colleague who started, behaviorally was just, more gruff or harder to deal with. And I found myself in a similar situation going through some of my own personal stuff, where instead of someone saying, hey, are you okay? Like, this isn't
Mm.
your normal, demeanor. Are you okay? Uh, just being like, oh, they're being a jerk. But putting all that together, it really made sense to me how important having a peer support team is. Um, just being able to identify when someone maybe is dealing with something either at work, at home, an injury, right? And I think those are the things that we kind of forget about. We think, oh, you're on injury, you're off, and you don't realize how that separation from the organization um, impacts somebody, especially you go back to talking about team or family, and
Mm.
then all of a sudden, you're not able to come into work, people are going about their business and not necessarily following up, and that impact. So, um, yeah, both personally and professionally, had these different experiences that make me have a different perspective and understanding on why, peer support, and some of these things that we do are so important organizationally.
Yeah, thank you. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I really, obviously it never feels this way in the moment, but I think after some of the hardest things that I've gone through on a personal level, it really does allow me, or at least I'll speak for myself, it's allowed me to um, have a little bit of gratitude almost, even though it's like really hard and in the moment does not feel like that at all. Like, when you're going through your hardest moments in life, you're not like, I'm so grateful that this is happening right now. But afterwards, to your point, it gives a sense of clarity. I think it gives us the opportunity to show up for others in ways that maybe we didn't have the capacity to do before because maybe we didn't have that empathy or understanding of what it was like to go through those things. And I say this all the time, and I don't think that I would be where I am now. I don't think that I would have the passion that I do for wellness if I hadn't have gone through a lot of the things that I had gone through in my life. And so in that context, I have a sense of gratitude because now I have the ability to show up better than maybe I did before or would have had the capacity to do without it. And it sounds to me like that was kind of your experience of like, wow, I went through these really hard things, but now I understand what it's like to go through those hard things and I can show up for my organization, with more empathy and compassion and understanding. And on the professional side of things, I have heard these stories before from individuals who had experienced that, where um, they leave and they feel like they're not valued, or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes like they don't even exist, anymore, and they feel really alone. And I think we all have that experience at some point in our life where, I think we tend to isolate ourselves a lot, in our hardest times because maybe we don't want to give a perception of being weak, or maybe we don't want, people to know what we're going through. Or maybe we just feel like we are the only ones that have ever gone through this ever, even though I think logically we know that there's other people who've gone through hard things. I think as humans, we tend to isolate ourselves. And so I really appreciate you talking about this idea of like how, no matter what, how can everyone in the organization know that they're not alone and that they're valued for the work that they do, regardless if they're, still working within the organization, if they're retired, if they're out on injury. How can we put forth the resources and the actionable steps, not just talking about it, but the actionable steps
Mm-hmm.
to reach out to people so that they know that they're valued, they're a part of the team, and they're not alone?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you absolutely sum it up perfectly. And ultimately, just having, again, it's just being open to understanding that, everyone deals with things differently. So some people are fine, they go and they do and they get better, and it's not a big deal. But for others, it is extremely isolating. And so making sure that you're reaching out and, you know, demonstrating that you care. And I think the biggest point out of all of this is, we're expected to care and protect our communities each and every day. And so one of the things I talk about internally is how do we care and take care of each other internally as well, right?
Yeah.
Because for us to be our best out there, we also, have to take care of ourselves.
Yeah,
So
100%. Do
yeah.
you know, I'm sure you do, Chief LeBaron, he retired
Mm-hmm.
recently, you're familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So he had said, he was on the podcast and he had said something that I thought was really interesting. He's the only person that's ever said this before. But it was this idea that he said, historically, we've always just assumed that everyone was okay unless otherwise flagged,
Mm-hmm.
or told. And he said that he wants to take this approach that everyone is going through something. If you just
Mm-hmm.
assume that everyone is going through something, or everyone is, going through challenges, or, in his words, he said everyone is hurting, then how can you then show up for them, assuming that there's something, right? Instead of assuming something like everything's okay. And I think that, for me at least, I would rather reach out to someone who's totally fine and
Mm-hmm.
just be like, I'm here. And they're like, I'm good. Like, are you sure? Okay, cool. Like actually having that conversation. And I would rather reach out to someone who's fine, assuming that they're not fine, than to have missed an opportunity to reach out to someone who's not okay.
Yeah.
So I thought it was a really interesting concept of like, how do we just have that understanding that in general, everyone's going through stuff, everyone needs resources, everyone, instead of just assuming that everyone's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at the world, right? It goes back to that idea of like be kind, right, to
Mhm.
whoever you meet because you don't know what they're going through,
Exactly.
right? Most people don't talk about whatever those struggles are, they should show up. So I think that idea of being kind and to everyone, but I also think there's another side to it, which is, and you kind of alluded to it, which is if I reach out and they say they're okay, like it's okay to be okay too,
Yep.
um, but knowing that there are people who care, about you, I think is important. No matter what you do, that
Yeah.
the folks that your team cares about your well-being and, is there to support you.
I think it's an
Important.
important note that, like, on the receiving end, knowing that if someone reaches out to you, it's an act of love or it's an act of care. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, I've done this before where someone reaches out to me and I'm almost like offended. I'm like, I'm good. Like, why are you
Mm-hmm.
reaching out? But I think it's a really good note that, like, if we are on the receiving end of that and someone reaches out to us and, is genuinely asking how we're doing, that we view that as a sign of care.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you are okay, that's great. But just knowing that there are people who are reaching out, and I think everyone can agree that it feels good. When someone like takes
Yeah.
time out of their day to like look you in the eye and genuinely show care, that feels good, even if you need it or not. I think it really does impact the way that you show up. I want to work with people who care about me and see the value in what I do. And I'm sure everyone who's listening to this feels that way too. I've never ever met someone who's like, yeah, I just want to show up and work with people who don't care about me and don't value me. And I'm going to show up with a good attitude, So I think it's important on both ends. How do we show up for other people? How do we also, on the receiving end, recognize when people are showing up for us?
No, I agree.
My final question for you before we wrap is for the younger generation. We've kind of all, I think, laughed at this. And, last time I saw you was at a conference. I think we were kind of laughing at this too. It's like um, when I was younger, you couldn't tell me what to do. And I think it's harder to be proactive. It's a lot easier to be reactive than proactive. And so,
Mm-hmm.
for those younger men and women who are entering into the profession today, who will eventually be, tomorrow's leaders, what words of advice could you pass along to them? Maybe something that you wish you would have known earlier, or something that's helped you along the way that could help them out too.
Um, I'm guessing there'll probably be some echo in what I'm saying compared to a lot of the other folks that you've talked with. But I think one of the big things is really um, finding your passion, right? Both in the organization and outside the organization. I think it's really important that you enjoy what you're doing, that you learn something new every day. My folks hear me say that all the time. Oh, I learn something new every day. And that's the honest truth. I learn something new every day. Now it's different than when I was working patrol when I first starting out, right? But I'm still learning something new every day. And I think that being open to grow and learn is really, really important just in your overall career, your overall personal well being. I would also say, find something that you're passionate about outside of work too. For me, it's my horses. I love to ride. It's, where I go and just focus on being outside, being in nature, being, with my horse. And that's like my balance for me. So I would say I think both of those things are really important. But aside from that, um, going back to the early part of our conversation, be open. Be open to new and different experiences. I think it's human nature to get comfortable doing something, and then you don't want to take on this different challenge or whatever. But take on the challenges, prepare yourself. Whether that's education, courses that you're learning, physical fitness, right? All of these things that are available in policing. Prepare yourself so that when those opportunities, arise, that you're willing and able to walk through the door and take on those different challenges. Um, and I mean, this profession truly is a calling. I do believe that, and we all come to it for a variety of different reasons, but really know your why. I got an email this the other day from one of our new recruits talking about knowing his why, and I think that that's so valuable because that's going to hold you through your whole career, however long that is. A few years and then shifting one agency, another agency, or in my case, 28 years with the same agency, whatever that is. Know your why and hold true to it, and it may change, and that's okay too. But know what it is and be passionate about what you do. It's really important.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you so
welcome.
much for your time. I was really
My
looking forward to this
pleasure.
conversation, and I really
Me
appreciate you
too.
coming on here and sharing your insights. So, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.